Welcome to Echoes International Podcast, with teaching, interviews and stories of what God is doing straight from the mission field and also within the UK. For more podcasts, stories and opportunities to get involved, check out our website at echoesinternational.org.uk and our other social media channels.
Good evening. It's actually quite strange watching that intro video. I haven't seen that for about 2 years actually since our digital guys put that together, and my first reaction was I've put on a slight bit of weight and lost a little bit of hair, so that's what kind of 2 years does to you. But really great to see many of you here this evening. As Jim said, thank you for coming out this evening. You could have been hidden at home behind walls full of toilet roll and so forth. If you choose to come out to us tonight, I was actually saying to the Echoes guys, they should have incentivized it. They should have actually said a free toilet roll and a free bottle of hand sanitizer for anyone who came out here tonight. But I think Gollum has already got all of the toys. So there we are. But no, great that you're here. Hope you enjoy this evening, and a real privilege to be speaking with you this evening. As Jim said in his introduction, I work for an organization called Solas, the Solas Centre for Public Christianity, based a couple of hours from here, depending on the traffic, down in Dundee. And if you are astute this evening, you will have noticed this is not a Dundee accent. So I hail originally from London, then spent 6 years in Toronto in Canada, and then moved here to Dundee because a friend over here said Dundee is the centre of Scotland, and apparently that's not true. I gather there's a debate between whether it's here or Edinburgh, but we know it's here. Of course, exactly. Thank you. It's exactly. So Solas is based in Dundee, and we specialise at Solas in a couple of things. We specialise in taking the message of Jesus out of the four walls of the churches and going particularly into places where Christians don't often go. We go into universities and pubs and restaurants and cafes to explain why we think Jesus had some things to say that were worth listening to. So I'm used to addressing very hostile audiences. You do look like a particularly friendly audience this evening, but sometimes I have to speak to Baptists, and my word, they can be feisty. And then we also teach and train and equip Christians how to talk naturally about their faith in Jesus with their friends and their neighbours and their colleagues and their classmates. As Jim mentioned, I've written a couple of books. One is on the bookstall. I promised the bookstall I'd give them a plug, which is my book, The Atheist Who Didn't Exist. But you can also actually get that for the princely sum of £3 a month, because on your seat is a little information leaflet about Solas. And if you're a guest this evening, this does not apply to you. You're here as our guest. But if you're a Christian here this evening and you would like to consider helping what we do at Solas, £3 a month will help us do more of the work we do. And as a thank you, we'll give you a book. So you can come and see me at the coffee break. One of the housekeeping announcements, and then we'll dive in to tonight's topic. While I speak, I'm going to send around a couple of clipboards. We'll start one over here. I have sanitized my hands, so that is medically clean. It may not be by the end, I don't know. And if you put your email address down on that clipboard, we'll do a couple of things. First thing we'll do, we'll sell your email to Google and make a small fortune. Thanks, Jim. Pay you later for laughing at that joke. No, seriously, what we'll do, we will send you all of the slides from tonight. So there's going to be various kind of quotes and bits and pieces on the screen behind me. Some of you, if you are note-taking types, rather than try and keep up with the speed that I go, we will send you those from Solas if we have your email address and can read it. So, are we matter, or do we matter? Well, to set the scene for where I want to go this evening, a story that I want to tell you took place just over 100 years ago, about 140 years ago. The night was the 3rd of July, 1884, and 4 English sailors on board a yacht called the Mignonette encountered a terrible storm in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The yacht sank, leaving them stranded in a tiny little wooden lifeboat. They had almost no water, no food to speak of, and by their 8th day adrift, they were desperate. Very, very desperate, and so they made a fateful decision. They decided that they would kill the cabin boy, who was already sick from drinking seawater. They decided 3 of them would kill the weakest member of the party, and for 4 more days, until they were rescued, they survived by cannibalism. They fed on his body, and they drank his blood to keep themselves alive. Now, when they were eventually rescued and returned to England and the story broke, it made headlines around the world, and it scandalized the nation. Absolutely scandalized the nation. The survivors were put on trial, charged with murder. One sailor turned state's witness, and 2 others went to trial and freely confessed to what they'd done. They didn't try and cover it up. They didn't try and deny it. They claimed, though, they had done so out of necessity. It was very simple. 3 men lived, 1 man died, rather than 4 people died. Now, here's an interesting thought experiment, I guess, for us to reflect on this evening. If you were the judge in the Mignonette trial, I wonder how you would proceed. How would you find those 3 sailors who stood in the dock in front of you? What conclusions would you draw? Because that story leads to 2 possible conclusions. On the one hand, you might take a purely utilitarian conclusion. You might go, well, 1 person died, 3 people survived, and the young man who died, tragic as it was, I mean, unlike the older sailors, he had no dependents, no one relying on him, so he left no grieving widow, no grieving children. I suspect very few of you in the audience this evening, though, are looking at the story going, yeah, well, that's okay. I mean, I suppose 1 person died, 3 people lived. Most of us this evening are not that way inclined. If the person sitting next to you is that way inclined, you might want to change seats this evening, just in case they get peckish, around about the time of the Q&A, and so on and so forth. You see, most of us have a much more visceral reaction to that story. Most of us would consider that what those 3 sailors did over 100 years ago was fundamentally wrong. Absolutely fundamentally wrong, because those sailors violated the cabin boy's rights and his dignity and his value. See, whether it's a small crime against humanity, the death of a cabin boy under desperate circumstances, or it's a major one, the Rwandan genocide, Stalin's Russia, what ISIS have done as they brutalized their way across the Middle East. Most of us here in this room tonight, most of our friends and our neighbors across Western democracies, in fact much of the world, have the same reaction. We believe that it's wrong, it's unjust, it is evil even to violate the dignity of another human being. And that powerful belief about dignity and about rights is enshrined, in fact, in a very famous document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, signed on the 10th of December 1948. One of the most important legal documents probably in the last few hundred years, possibly arguably in human history, actually to be written in terms of the way so much of our law today depends on it. Listen to these very famous words from the introduction to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It reads, "Recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom and justice and peace in the world. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights." You know, we're passionate about human rights. We get excited about them. We award Nobel Prizes to celebrate them. But there is a fairly basic question that is often overlooked when it comes to human rights. These rights, this dignity, this value that this document and modern human rights laws are based upon, where is it located? What does it depend upon? Where, if we, dissected you, would we find your human rights, for example? Where in us are they located? In other words, however noble, however wonderful, however beautiful these words on the screen behind me may sound, are they true? And to answer that question, we need to answer a far more basic question this evening. What, in fact, is a human being? What actually is a human being? Because unless we know what a person is, unless we know what a human being is, we can't begin to address far weightier questions about your value, about your dignity, and so on and so forth. So, in short, what does it mean to be human? Now, many of my atheist friends have some very strong views on that subject and attempt to answer that question, what does it mean to be human, in purely material, purely natural terms, not allowing God so much as 1 inch of a foot in the door. Listen to these words from a gentleman called Stephen J. Gould, a very famous paleontologist, committed atheist, died a few years ago, but a very eloquent writer. And here is he wrestling with the question of what we are as human beings. Stephen wrote, he said, "The human species has inhabited this planet for only 250,000 years or so, roughly 0.0015% of the history of life, the last inch of the cosmic mile. The world fared perfectly well without us for all but the last moments of earthly time. And this fact makes our appearance look more like an accidental afterthought than the culmination of a prefigured plan. We are here because one odd group of fishes had a peculiar fin anatomy that could transform into legs for terrestrial creatures. We are here because comets struck the earth and wiped out dinosaurs, thereby giving mammals a chance not otherwise available. So thank your lucky stars in a very literal sense. We are here because the earth never froze entirely during an ice age, not even in Scotland. Because a small and tenuous species arising in Africa 250,000 years ago has managed, so far, to survive by hook and by crook. We may yearn for a higher answer, but none exists. This explanation, though superficially troubling, if not terrifying, is ultimately liberating and exhilarating. We cannot read the meaning of life passively in the facts of nature. We must construct these answers ourselves from our own wisdom and own ethical sense. There is no other way." My word, that man can spin a paragraph. It's beautiful words, very eloquent. But Stephen is playing a little bit fast and loose with the facts here. If the picture he paints about who we are, that we are nothing more than a series of lucky accidents, then there is no meaning to human life to be found, period. Not merely none to be found, but none to be created. You know, if I was to take a bag of Scrabble tiles and throw them across the front of the church here, the random letters have no meaning, period. Even if 2 or 3 of them manage to line up in such a way they spell out a word, that's just luck. There is no meaning, there is no intention to those Scrabble tiles. And if Stephen is right, then human beings, we are biology and just biology. Nothing less, but certainly nothing more. And the idea that we are just biology, just the stuff with which we are made, is expressed fairly forcefully by other atheists too. Here in full flow is Francis Crick, one of the co-discoverers of DNA, that molecule of life that's found in every cell in every living thing. Francis Crick says, you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll's Alice might have phrased it, you are nothing but a pack of neurons. Well, others put it even more bleakly. One more example for you of how our atheist friends are thinking about this subject. Perhaps the most famous atheist writing, certainly the last 20 or 30 years or so, Richard Dawkins of Oxford University. Richard's book on atheism, The God Delusion, has sold about 13 million copies. So although Richard does not believe in God, his bank manager gives thanks every day. And Richard wrote this a few years ago now. He said, we are survival machines. We are robot vehicles programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. Our genes made us. We animals exist for their preservation, and we are nothing more than throwaway survival machines. The world of the selfish gene is one of savage competition, ruthless exploitation, and deceit. Actually, that last sentence sounds like the lineup at Asda last night for the last bottle of hand sanitizer, but there we are. Cheerful stuff, though. Next time when you go home this evening and you're, cleaning your teeth, look yourself in the mirror and say to yourself, I am nothing more than a throwaway survival machine, and see if you feel more cheerful because of that. Now, here's the thing. If Dawkins is right, if Crick is right, if Gould is right, that has some pretty profound implications would follow from that. A few years ago now, I was speaking at a university back in Canada where I was living at the time. I'd done an event a bit like this one, a bit larger. We had about 300 there that night. And at the end of the event, a young student came walking down the aisle to speak to me. And he got to the front. We didn't even get so far as hello. He walked up to me almost nose to nose. It was the day before major viruses where you could stand nose to nose and not get in trouble for that. And he looked at me and he said, the problem with your entire presentation tonight, Andy, is you're a Christian and I hate Christians. I thought, this is going to go well. So I looked at him, I said, well, it's nice to meet you too. Why do you hate Christians? He said, the reason I hate Christians is because you lot, it's going to go well when someone jabs their finger and says, you lot. You lot are anti-gay, anti-progress, anti-science, anti-trans, anti-environment, anti-reason, anti-women. There are about 5 or 6 other antis in his list, actually. There were words I never heard of before. I didn't know I was supposed to be against these particular things as a Christian. I felt the need to actually get a notepad out and start taking notes. If you're going to be a bigot, at least be a fully informed one. And perhaps there were groups I should be offended that I wasn't. Anyway, got to the end of his little rant, and at this point there was an audience gathered around. There were about 10 or 20 people gathered around listening to this encounter, and I found myself thinking, I wonder what I say, because I've got maybe 2 or 3 minutes to respond. He's listed so many things, and an idea popped into my head. I looked at him and I said, what was the last thing on your list? He said, Christians are anti-women. I said, interesting, I don't think Christians are, actually. I said, but just hypothetically, if we were, what would be wrong with that? I wish I could have taken a photo of his face and put it on the PowerPoint slide, because he did quite a good impression of a goldfish. His mouth kind of opened and closed, and he sort of fought for his words for a moment, and then he said, well, it's just wrong, isn't it? I said, come on, you're a student at one of the best universities in Canada. You can do better than that. And he thought for a moment, and he said, well, it's wrong to discriminate against people on the basis of their gender. I said, that's really impressive. You've used some very long words in there, but you've just said the same thing. You've just rephrased it. Okay, why is it wrong to discriminate against somebody on the basis of their gender? And we went to and fro, actually. For about the next 5 minutes, he would try and give me a reason, and I would just smile innocently and say, why? I had a 4-year-old in the house at the time, so I was very familiar with short words that begin with W and end with question marks. And finally, he got to the end of our little encounter, and he looks at me and he says, "This is really frustrating. I cannot tell you why. There must be a reason, but I can't tell you." I said, "Interesting, actually, that you can't, because as a Christian, the reason I believe it's wrong to discriminate against people on the basis of their gender is I believe all human beings are made in the image of God, as the Bible says, and bear value and dignity because of the way that God created them. But you, on the other hand, are struggling." I confess I pushed it slightly further, and I said, "Tell me, what are you studying here at this university?" He said, "I'm training to be a doctor. I'm in the medical program." I went, "Oh, brilliant, really good. What branch of medicine are you thinking of going into?" He said, "Oh, I want to be a surgeon. One day I want to cut people open." I said, "Maybe don't lead with that on your application letter. I'd like to come and work at your hospital and cut people open." But I said, "Look, that's interesting, because one day if you achieve your dream and you end up as a doctor, you will have terrific power over life and death. And you will maybe one day be tempted to treat patients in a way that's unethically appropriate and less than the dignity they should be afforded." And I said to him, "I hope if that day ever comes and that temptation ever comes, by that point you have found a better basis for treating somebody with dignity because I should, because I should, because I should, because I should. Because otherwise, quite frankly, God help your patience." You see, he was struggling to answer the question, why do human beings have value and dignity? And the reason he was struggling is if Richard Dawkins is right, if Francis Crick is right, if Stephen Jay Gould is right, we are just the stuff of which we are made. We can't answer the what does it mean to be human question, and we have no basis for value and dignity. And like that young man, we kind of know that we should affirm it, but the moment someone says to us why, we're struggling for answers. So what's the Christian answer to this question? If atheism, I think, cannot tell us why we have rights and dignity, if it can't tell us what it means to be human and for what we were designed, then what does the Bible have to offer on this question? Well, in the very first book of the Bible, in fact, the very first chapter of the very first book of the Bible, the very first page of the Old Testament, we read some words that are absolutely mind-blowing in their scope and foundational in their importance. I alluded to them a moment ago in that story of that university student. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 27, we read these words. "Then God said, 'Let us make humankind in our image, in our likeness. Let them rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground.' So God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them." You know, this claim that human beings bear the image of God is unique to Christianity. You will not find a statement anything like that in the Quran, the scripture of Islam. You will not find it in the Bhagavad Gitas of Hinduism or in any other religious text. Only the Bible makes this staggeringly high claim about what it means to be human. But these words are not just some theological idea. They are foundational because they give us a basis for value and they give us a basis for ethics. Let's explore both those ideas for a moment. So we'll begin with value. And the claim that the Bible makes that human beings are created in the image of God provides a rock-solid, unshakable, concrete foundation for your value and for your identity and for your dignity. According to the Bible, it doesn't matter what your gender is, it doesn't matter your age or your ability or your IQ or how much you earn or any of those things. It doesn't matter what you've done or what your record is. According to the Bible, you are made in the image of God and thus you have value. Now, if you take that idea away, if you throw that idea away, you are left with the question that our atheist friends are struggling with. How do you find the value? How do you ground the value of a human life? Well, let's do a little experiment this evening. If we live in a godless universe, let's pretend there is no God for a moment. If we live in a godless universe, how do we actually find a basis for your value and dignity this evening? Or maybe if I was a chemist, maybe we might do it based upon your chemical parts. We'll pick on Jim here. He's sitting in the front row, always a dangerous thing to do. We'll drag Jim off to my secret laboratory, buried deep in the catacombs under Findlay Church. And I've got a big test tube into which we will place our host this evening. And I'll boil him down to his constituent parts. So much iron, so much sodium, so much phosphorus, so much fat, so much fat. Let's not go there any further. He's given me a dirty look. And what we'll do is we'll take the chemicals, formerly known as Jim, and we'll stick them on eBay and see what we can get for them. And actually, this experiment the experiment hasn't been done, the calculation's been done, and it's been calculated. The average human being is worth about £2.50. More like £4 if you've still got traces of hand sanitizer on you. And but most of us would know that's probably therefore not a good way to value human life. Hopefully most of us appreciate that the person sitting next to them is worth more than £2.50. So if we can't do it using chemistry, then what do we do? Well, I guess if I was a psychologist, we might measure your IQ. And those of you with an IQ north of 140, have a special set of rights and dignity. Between 100 and 140, you've got some rights, but a bit less. Anybody whose IQ is less than 100, well, we're just going to enslave you and use you for all the dirty jobs. Again, I imagine most of us would not want to live in a society where people's rights and value is based upon how smart they are. So that one fails too. I guess if I was an anthropologist, maybe we might look at how the community values you. We could count up how many friends you have, both the real variety and the pretend ones you accumulate on social media. And the more popular you are, the more value we assign to you. And again, most of us, a moment's thought, would say that's a very, very unnerving idea to have a society that said that the more popular that you were, the more rights, the more dignity, the more value you had. Well, now we're running out of options. If we can't do it with chemistry, we can't do it with psychology, we can't do it with sociology, I suppose the last one might be financially. If I was an economist, maybe we might say, let's just do it this way. We'll look at the size of your bank balance, calculate how much you earn, or if you're a younger member of the audience not working yet, how much you might earn in the future, and those who are destined to be millionaires, lots of rights and dignity. Those of you who are going to be earning much less, sorry again, bottom of the value heap. And again, most of us would not want to live in a society that values people based upon their income or their earning potential. And the more you do those experiments, the more you realize anybody with half a brain knows those are terrible ways to find the value of a human being. If we start valuing people based upon the chemicals that make them up, the size of their brain, the number of friends they've got, or their income, then we all lose out. Unless you are a grossly overweight lawyer with great social networking skills, then in which case maybe you win that game. Somebody recently pointed out that lawyer sounds like liar in a Somerset accent, which is interesting. I'll leave you to think about why that might be the case. But I say to my atheist friends, though, if those ways don't work, what way? Because I only know one way to actually ground value and dignity, to give a secure basis for all of our value and identity. And that's where the Bible locates it, and the fact that all of us, whether we are short or tall or incredibly smart or not so intellectual, whether we're introverts or extroverts, whether we have more money than you could possibly imagine, or whether we're scraping to make ends meet, all of us have the same value and dignity because we're made in the image of God by our Creator. So the Bible's teaching that we bear the image of God is absolutely foundational for human value. It's also foundational for something deeply and closely connected, which is the whole subject of ethics and how we treat one another. You know, we live in a culture that increasingly encourages us to treat one another as numbers, as things, as means to an end. And there's a big question, really, I think, increasingly in our society of how do we find a basis for the hugely important idea that we should treat one another with value and dignity and generosity and compassion. You know, we've been joking a bit to sort of lighten the mood about the coronavirus right now, but there's a very interesting comment I read on social media the other day where somebody said, you know, what does it say about our society that people are going out and hoarding things like hand sanitizer rather than thinking about maybe I'll buy what I need and leave some for my neighbors and my friends and for others? How do we ground society? How do we give a basis for treating one another with compassion and thoughtfulness, not just our friends and our neighbours, but also our enemies too? Well, among all the world's peoples, the Dalits of India have suffered some of the world's greatest sadness and pain and persecution. They sit at the very bottom of India's highly stratified caste system and are still considered, even in modern India, by many to be literally untouchable. Dalit women bear the brunt of much of this, and 2/3 of Dalit women have been sexually abused, 750,000 trafficked into sexual slavery, yet the conviction rate for crimes against Dalits is just 5%. How do you change a mindset? How do you change a culture that says that a person is literally worth less because of where she is born, because of his caste, and so on? It's all very well for those of us in comfortable societies like Scotland to go, well, all people are born equal. Those are just meaningless platitudes to people who daily experience this kind of discrimination. I was recently reading an interview with a Dalit religious leader who said the problem is that in our society, by the time a child is just 14 years old, he or she has been told their entire life that they are worthless, that they are valueless, and that has really begun to sort of define the whole way that they view themselves and their place in the world. But the interview didn't stop there. He carried on. He said, we have found, though, there is a solution. He said, we've begun to find in our community that the solution is from a very young age to speak a totally different belief system, a totally different worldview into the ears of our young people. And the Dalits are finding that it's the biblical worldview with this claim that all men and all women, no matter who they are, have value and dignity, that bear God's image, is a powerful corrective. And if you Google news stories on the Dalit community and the Christian faith, you'll read stories of tens of thousands from that community in recent years becoming followers of Jesus, not least because of what it's done for their young people. See, here's the thought for you this evening. If you tell a child all of her life or his life that they are worthless, there will be consequences. Here in the West, though, we're trying a different educational experiment. We're running a different experiment on our young people right now. We're experimenting to see what happens if you raise a generation of young people to believe they are just tormented atoms in a bed of mud, just an accidental collection of atoms, just robotic genetic vehicles dancing to their DNA, nothing but packs of neurons, or just a 1% bit of pollution in the universe. All quotes from leading atheists about what they think human beings actually are. I increasingly find myself thinking, I wonder what's going to happen when this generation grows up and start acting out this philosophy. I wonder what that world will look like when they become our future political leaders. Well, the question of what it means to be human is profoundly important. But in my last 10 minutes or so, I want to consider the second side to this question. There's another side to this whole question of what it means to be human. We need an answer to the question, what does it mean to be human, that addresses our nobility, that gives us a basis for value and for dignity. But we also need something that addresses the fact that we are flawed. Because one of the challenges for atheism is to explain why human beings go wrong in so many ways. No matter how much education, no matter how politics or healthcare or science you pour in, we do not arrive at secular utopias. As the poet Randall Jarrell put it, he said, most of us know by now that Rousseau was wrong. That mankind, when you knock his chains off, sets up the death camps. Soon we shall know everything the 18th century didn't know and nothing that it did. And it will be hard to live with us. If this is true, why is it true? If we are made in the image of God, why are we as human beings so often beastly to one another? Well, here it might be helpful to reflect on the nature of the word image for a moment. Built into the idea of the word image is the idea of reflection. And if human beings were designed and created to reflect God's image, that means we were created in God's image. That means we were designed to reflect God's image to the world. And the question for each one of us in this room this evening and watching on the live stream is, if you choose not to reflect God with your life, what will you reflect? You see, if it isn't God, it's probably going to end up being something like work or family or success or performance, or even, heaven help us, will end up like Narcissus of Greek legend, so transfixed by his own cleverness and beauty and image that he ignored everything else. But those things will ultimately destroy you if you try to make them in the center of your lives, because no mirror can be the source of its own light. David Foster Wallace was a Pulitzer Prize nominated novelist, very famous writer, very influential writer a few years ago, also a committed atheist. But of all the atheists I'm quoting at you this evening, he was the one, I think, who came up with perhaps the most interesting take on what it means to be human. And in an essay he wrote towards the end of his life, made an interesting observation. He wrote, "In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is actually no such thing as not worshipping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, you will never have enough, never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you'll always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die 1,000,000 deaths before they finally plant you. If you worship power, you will feel weak and afraid. You will need ever more power over others to keep the fear at bay. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, and you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out, and so on." And what Foster Wallace, as an atheist, is nudging at here, something he's figured out, is that whatever is the source of your meaning and your joy, your satisfaction, whatever you've built your life around, the problem is you need it. You have to have it. You're like an addict. If you don't have that thing, your life isn't worth living. And whatever that thing is, maybe it's your job, maybe it's a standard of living, maybe it's some relationship you're in, it will end up controlling you. And the problem is, if you try and serve your career and you fail, or serve your sporting prowess and you fail, or you're living for your image or your bank balance or that relationship and you fail, that failure will end up destroying you with hatred and anxiety and self-loathing. By contrast, at the heart of the Christian faith stands a radically different claim that Jesus was crucified for you. Because how do we deal with the fact that the mirror of our souls, as it were, is cracked and broken and distorted, that we don't reflect God in the way we were designed to do? Well, the theme of the image of God that begins on the first page of the Bible runs right through towards the end of the Bible, where in the New Testament we find the answer to that question. Let me read you some other famous words from the Bible, this time from the Apostle Paul and the book of Colossians at the other end of the Bible in the New Testament. He writes, "God has rescued us from the dominion of darkness, and he has brought us into the kingdom of the Son that he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. In him all things were created, whether things in heaven, on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all of his fullness dwell in him, and through him, through Jesus, in other words, to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross." See, as we draw these threads together, according to the Bible, it is Jesus who is the perfect image of God. It is Jesus who is willing to be trampled on and broken and rejected for us, so that our broken images might be remade and restored and forgiven. The story of Jesus' life and death and resurrection are at their heart all about restoration. The promise the Bible offers us that in Jesus we have the promise and the power to restore that image of God that has become broken and twisted in us. And if that story is true, then it means to be human is to be made with a purpose. We were made for something. We're not so much made of something, but for something. We were made to discover God's love, to love others in return, and to love our neighbor. If Christianity is true, love is the supreme value, the supreme ethic built into the universe. And that gives us an incredible foundation for human rights and value and dignity and justice. Love is what it means to be human. I opened this evening with a story of tragedy. Let me end with a story that's also slightly tragic, but has a very different note of hope baked into it. The gentleman on the screen behind me is a man whose story deserves to be much better known than it is. His name is Maximilian Kolbe. Who was he? Well, he was a Polish Catholic monk arrested by the German Gestapo in 1941 in Poland for his human rights activism. He had been rescuing Jews and other victims of the Third Reich, hiding them in his home and smuggling them out of the country to safety. And in 1941, the Gestapo found what he was doing. They arrested him and they shipped him off to the notorious Auschwitz concentration camp. 1 year after his internment in that camp, a prisoner escaped from Auschwitz. And prisoner escapes drove the authorities, drove the Nazis nuts. And the commandant of the camp was determined that nobody would ever escape from Auschwitz again. And he had a plan to make sure that never happened. He gathered all the prisoners in the concentration camp together in the prison yard, and he announced that he was about to read the name of 10 men at random. And those men would be taken away and locked up in an underground cell with no food, no water, no light, and left to die there in the dark as a message. If you escape from this concentration camp, this is what we do to your friends. Those names were read out, and when one of the names on that list was read out, it was a friend of Maximilian's. And when this man's name was read out, he began having hysterics, as you might imagine. This man fell to the ground, he began weeping and crying out. He began weeping and crying out, my family, my wife, my children, whatever will become of them? On hearing those words and seeing that reaction, Maximilian stepped out of the crowd of prisoners and looked the commandant squarely in the eye and said, "Sir, may I take the place of my friend?" And the commandant agreed, and Maximilian was led away with those 9 other prisoners, thrown into that underground bunker with those 9 other men, where they died without food or water there in the dark. And the reason we know Maximilian's story is his friend survived the concentration camp, survived the war, and spent the rest of his life telling the story of what had been done for him by the man who gave his life for him. Why did Maximilian do that? Because he was a devoted and devout follower of Jesus Christ and was trying to live out that idea that love should underpin everything because of what God had done for him in Jesus. So Jesus, who said, "Greater love has no one than this, that they lay down their life for their friends." And Jesus, of course, demonstrated that himself when he gave his life for me and for you and for each one of us. And that's an important point to land on, because if we say that human rights and value and dignity only makes sense if God exists, that raises the question, which God are we talking about? And in Jesus, we have a God who looks very different. A God who is willing to pay an incredibly high price. A God who is willing to pay the highest price for each one of you, for each one of us here this evening. The heart of the Christian faith stands the outrageous, the radical, the incredible claim that human beings are not just atoms and particles. You are not just the stuff of which you are made. You are more than your component parts. You are more than your economic production. You are more than your psychology. You are more than the total of your friendships. You are more than your moral performance, more than the things that you do. Each one of us here in this room watching on the live stream, we are image bearers who have incredible value and significance. Value so high that Jesus is willing to give his very life to restore and forgive and win you back to him, to put right that brokenness that lies at the heart of each one of us, so that the mirror of our souls might be angled correctly at him and reflect the true image of God as it was intended. That's what it means to be human. It's the unique claim at the heart of the Christian faith, and it's why only, if Christianity is true, as I believe it is, that human rights and dignity and value makes any kind of sense at all whatsoever. Thanks for listening so patiently. Jim.
I've got the easy job. I get to ask the questions.
Well, I've told him that if there's any hard questions that I can't answer, then he's going to have a go at them. Or if you've got a question tonight you'd like Jim to answer, just direct it to him.
Before I start as well, can I just say thank you to those who have got neat handwriting. It's really a huge difference to me if I can read the question. There's one person I do know the handwriting. I had to ask him what he was saying because I couldn't read it. Anyway, okay, let's go with our first question, Andy. So,
Let's go.
Oh, nice, easy one to start with.
Why do I not think that is the case?
No, I think it will.
Glimmer in your
Compared
eyes,
to some of them. How do you respond to someone who says life is meaningless and just accepts that it is meaningless and has given up?
Gosh, there's a question. How do you respond to someone who thinks that life is meaningless and just given up? I mean, I think that the first thing I guess I'd want to say to whoever is asking that, and if you've got a friend or a loved one who's in that situation, when there's someone who genuinely does think that life is meaningless and has just given up, it's very, very tragic. I think a lot of people play with the idea that life is meaningless and will say that, but actually when you poke around a bit, there is meaning there, that there's something they're hanging on to. But I think when somebody has genuinely arrived at the conclusion that life is meaningless and is trying to live that out, that's a pretty dark place. I think I'd want to begin by saying to that person, first of all, actually, and you may find it odd to hear a Christian say this, I actually partly agree with their conclusions. If we live in a godless universe, life is meaningless. Life is deeply meaningless because there is nothing more to do than try and pass your genes on to the next generation through reproduction, and then once you've done that, you've had kids and you've made sure they're okay, your work here is done. Think of Professor Dawkins and others. The thing is, though, what's interesting is we as human beings are the only creatures in the whole of the natural world who are not happy to live that way. Squirrels are happy to, mate, collect a few nuts and hibernate and sort of get on with life. Most of the animal kingdom is happy just to survive and reproduce. Human beings, though, we need to find meaning. We yearn for purpose. We have great anxiety if we can't find it. The very fact, I would say to that person, that they are asking that question and struggling with it is the big indicator that there is something else going on. And then I think I would pivot to the answer to them to be saying, look, take a long, hard look at the Christian faith. Because if it's true, there is meaning to be found. I remember doing a talk on the whole subject of meaning and purpose in life at the University of Toronto back when I was in Canada a few years ago. And I actually pushed it quite hard on the idea that if there is no God, there is no meaning. And we got to the Q&A, and it was a live Q&A. People came to the mic, not through the paper. And the first person to the microphone was the head of the Atheist Society. I'd met him before, we had a few conversations, and Cameron was his name, and he came to the microphone. His opening question was related to this. He said, Andy, I've been wrestling with the whole question of meaningless for a long time, and I think you're broadly right, that if there is no God, there is no meaning in life. I think that's where I've arrived at that conclusion, and I wrestle with that every day. But just because there is no meaning without God doesn't prove that God exists. And that was his sort of challenge. And what I said to him is what I'd say to this person. I'd say, absolutely, just because there's no meaning without God doesn't prove there's God. But it does tell me if I was wrestling with meaninglessness, I would spend vast amounts of energy investigating the claims of the Christian faith. Because if that's the only place there might be meaning to be found, I would go, look, In the same way that if I was dying of some horrible disease and you told me there's a rumor, there's a chance that there's some hospital in Australia or wherever that's got a cure for this thing, I would be investing my savings and getting on that plane and going looking if it was my only hope. And so whoever's asked this, I would say, as a follower of Jesus, if the person who's asked that question is, just be imploring your friend to take a long, hard look at Jesus. Because if his claims stand up, the good news is there is meaning. So whilst they're in a dark place, potentially they're also halfway there in realizing there's no answer to the meaning question outside of the Christian faith.
Okay, this
That
question...
was an easy one. I love your definition of an easy one, Jim. This is
well,
encouraging.
I was just easing you in.
Easing me in, thank you.
This question picks up on some of the stuff you've mentioned this evening. So, if atheists are capable of living good moral lives, and religious people are capable of great evil, how then can it be said that morality comes from a belief in God?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a very good question. I think I'd respond to that question by saying the question at the end, how can we say that morality comes from God, isn't, of course, what I said this evening. If that's what I was heard to say this evening, I apologize for not communicating clearly enough. At no point in this evening's talk did I ever say that morality, we can't have moral behavior without God, nor would I claim that. Atheists can, of course, live great moral lives, lives of great morality. Christians can behave in appalling ways. That's not the question. The question is, does good exist in the first place? Is there such a thing as good? When an atheist friend behaves in a way that is good, what's the criteria that I'm using to determine whether that person is living a good life? When you look at a Christian, if you're a skeptic or a seeker or a guest here this evening, you look at a Christian, you go, gosh, they're behaving appallingly. What's the criteria that you're measuring them against? Because the big question is whether there is such things as good and evil, right and wrong, just and injustice in the world. And many, many thinkers and artists and theologians and philosophers and whatnot, not just Christian, but atheists as well, will tell you the big problem on atheism is the best we can get to is personal preference. If you're an atheist here this evening, it is perfectly okay if you just say, I don't like racism. You're okay to say that. But the moment you take the next step and you want to say racism is inherently wrong, whoa, now you have a problem. Because what's your basis for making that claim? What's the basis by which you've universalized your personal preferences and attempt to push them onto other people? And what's interesting about tonight's topic, that when Jim asked me to address this, is that I think the whole question of human rights is really interesting because it's so fundamental, it underlies so much else of ethics. Because I would say so much else in terms of morality and right and wrong and justice and injustice flows out of human rights. Why is it wrong to be violent against somebody? Because they bear rights and dignity. Why is it wrong to abuse somebody racially? Because no matter what your background, you have value and dignity. Why is it wrong to be sexist or to discriminate against on the basis of gender? Because everybody has value and dignity. And the question is, if that claim is true and stands up, and I think I showed this evening that flows from the idea that there actually is a God like the God of the Bible, then yes, there's a morality. And when atheists act morally and do wonderful things, we can praise them. And when Christians don't live up to those standards, we can, kick them in the leg and say, oh, you sort your life out. But if we live in a purely godless, materialistic universe, then that's all we have. We don't even have that, rather. But there's one other sting in the tail of this question. One of the problems with morality is once you start deciding that you are a good person, even as an atheist or as a Christian, once you start wandering around going, well, I'm a good person, I'm a decent person, have you seen my life? Do you know the kind of person I am? The danger is you then start looking down on others. Once I get it into my head that I'm a moral, decent person, it's very tempting for me to start looking down on Jim here and going, I'm a decent person. Have you seen what he does? Have you seen the kind of life he lives? He's not up to my standard. And that's where so much that goes wrong in society comes from, when we start discriminating and dividing people into those who are like us and who are decent and those who are like Jim and who aren't. And all kinds of horrible consequences follow. One of the amazing things for me in the Christian faith is it's the great leveler. Because Jesus looks at each one of us and says, you know what? However much you think you're a moral person, you're not. Because Jesus sees inside each of our lives and each of our hearts. He knows what we're really like. He knows what we're like on the inside. He sees past the lies that we tell to others and the lies that we tell to ourselves half the time. That's the bad news of the gospel. actually, that he knows what we're really, really like and doesn't let us off the hook. And Jesus is the great leveler, because all of us on that standard have fallen short. The good news of the Christian faith is that Jesus looks at us, despite the fact we all fail to measure up, and says, I love you nevertheless. And despite knowing exactly what you and I and each one of us, and Jim as well, are like, he still gave his life for each one of us. And what we need, I think, as a solution to so much that's ill in our world is not just a basis for morality, but also a basis for humility, something that brings us down from the places we try and push ourselves. And the gospel does that beautifully and powerfully and honestly.
Okay, next question.
Sorry, Jim, for picking on you for every illustration.
No, that's okay. I'm an easy target, a big target as well, of course. Easy to hit. Anyway, right. If we are valued, why has God allowed Satan and us to commit horrible atrocities to each other? And I guess he, as God, knew things would play out this way.
Yeah. Questions around these kind of topics, around suffering and evil and injustice and what's gone wrong in the world, are some of the most powerful questions, actually, and also some of the most interesting questions, because, of course, what's interesting straight away is we have this tendency as human beings, of course, to want to look at the world and point our finger at particular things and say, well, that's wrong, and that shouldn't be allowed. What's fascinating, of course, as I just saw in the earlier question, of course, as an atheist, one hasn't got the right to do that. As an atheist, the best you've got to do is the ability to say, well, I don't like that, but I can't tell them they're wrong because they've got the same right as I have to live life like they want to. When you step into the Christian faith, you have this wonderful framework for right and wrong and for good and evil because we believe in a God who created the moral universe, but then other questions pop up, like this one, which, why did God allow evil and injustice in the first place? A moment's reflection here, of course, tells you that God could, of course, have created a very different world. There's immediately two things, I think, that God could have done to make a world without evil and injustice. First thing he could have done is he could have created us as robots. A world where everyone just robotically does exactly what they're programmed to do would be a very, very moral world. It would be a world where we do exactly what we want, what God would want us to do. There'd be no evil, there'd be no injustice, there'd be none of those things. But there'd also be some other consequences. Because, of course, there are some things that robots and automata and machines can't do. One of the biggest, of course, is love. Love, by its very nature, inherently requires freedom. If you were to go home from this evening's event and tell your friends and your family that you went to this amazing event at Findlay Church, and at the end of the evening, the most amazing thing was that Jim, I'm going to pick on him again, fell to his knees and declared undying love for the speaker. He fell to Andy Bannister's feet and declared undying love. You don't need to act this one out, just to reassure you. Would it matter? Would you have missed something significant out if you did not tell your friend, your neighbor, your flatmate that at the moment that Jim declared undying love for me, I had a 12-bore shotgun pointed right at his forehead? Some would say that was an important fact that you missed because he was coerced and his statement of love was basically meaningless. And the same applies to God. If God had created us as robotic automata, then love at that moment becomes meaningless. But God wanted to create a world in which we were free to love him and we were free to love one another. And I think freedom is one of the greatest gifts that God gave to each one of us because it made love and many other things possible. But of course, with freedom comes the ability that we might use our freedom for good or we might use our freedom for ill. That is the consequence of freedom. And so much of, I think, what's gone wrong in our world is what's happened when men and women have taken that freedom that God has given us and used it not for its intent, namely love, but have used it for evil. And that begs the question, then what has God done about that? And I think the amazing truth of the heart of the Christian faith is not that God created us this way and then disappeared off into heaven and went, well, I'm going to leave them to get on with it. I'm glad I'm not down in here on earth, actually, because it looks like a right mess. I'm glad I'm up here in heaven. But the story of the God of the Bible, as you read on, is that knowing what would happen with the gift of freedom that was required to make love possible, God knew from the moment he created you and I that he would one day have to step into history in the person of Jesus and go through that whole agony of the cross and the price that he paid there to give us the ability to have put right what's gone wrong in each of our hearts and have that twist, that break, that fracture in our very hearts that causes us to do evil as well as good begin to be put back together again. So that's just the beginning of an answer to that question. That's a much bigger question than we can do justice to in just a 5-minute answer. There are some great books on that for those who want to go deeper. I recommend you have a look on the bookstall. But that's at least the beginning, I hope, for whoever asked that, of why that might be the case, that we have evil and injustice and suffering in the world.
This question actually came from our Facebook post. Somebody posted a question, well, a comment, and we've kind of turned it into a question.
Excellent. Okay,
so, how do you respond when someone labels you as arrogant and holier than thou for forcing your beliefs on them?
Well, gosh, there's so many things built into that question, actually. So let me just take 2 or 3 of them. Of course, the first thing I'd say, the way that question ends with the forced on them, I hope nobody here who would call themselves a follower of Jesus feels it's their role to go around forcing their beliefs on others. I spent half my life in front of very, very skeptical, hostile audiences. I certainly want to persuade them. I certainly want to encourage them to think about the Christian faith. I want to answer their questions. I want to tell them why I think Jesus is the best news ever. But I hope that doesn't involve, forcing or coercion or whatever. Not least people come to the events I speak at voluntarily. We don't sort of force them under shotgun conditions. So first thing, for those of us who are Christians here, let's make sure in the way that we're talking to our friends and our neighbors and our colleagues about Jesus, we're not banging people around the head, but we're explaining what we believe, why we believe it, why we think Jesus is such good news. That's the first thing. Second thing, of course, it's not actually arrogant to tell somebody that their beliefs are wrong. It's perfectly okay to tell someone in a conversation that you disagree with them. I've got an academic background. In academia, we do this all the time. As academics, we play around with ideas. Some of those ideas are right, some of those ideas are wrong, some are good, some are terrible. I've never been offended when a colleague has gone, Andy, that's a terrible idea, that clearly doesn't work. And I don't think I've offended any of my colleagues by reversing that. I think we are living in a world where increasingly, though, we're becoming so precious about our somewhat feeble sense of selves, that sometimes some of us become so attached to our ideas that when someone criticizes our ideas, they think they're attacking us personally. And I think one of the big struggles we have in society right now is we've forgotten how to disagree disagreeably. And I think we need to rediscover that art. Not least, of course, if you love somebody dearly, if you care about your friend or your neighbor or your family member, and you think they are on a path that is dangerous and deadly and in error, it's a loving thing to do to tell them that they're wrong. If my son, who's 4, decides he's going to try and teach himself knife juggling, it is not a loving thing as a parent to go, you know what, I can't tell Christopher he's wrong. He needs to go ahead and play with the knives, and we'll worry about the consequences. The loving thing to do at that point is to step in and go, that may not be a good idea. And for those of us who are Christians, of course, we believe that not merely is the news about Jesus the best news ever, we believe it's vital news. Because as human beings, there is something so broken with each one of us that we need saving, we need rescue. And Jesus primarily is God's rescue plan. Christians don't believe they are people who are morally perfect. Christians are people who've realized that they need help, have found the solution to that need, and want to share it with others. Sometimes they do it in a way that can be a bit clumsy, because we're not perfect, we're only human, but it's done out of love. And I think if it's done in that spirit, then it's perfectly okay to tell others what you believe, and it's not arrogant.
Okay, let's crack on. How do you get a foot in the door or start a conversation with someone who will dismiss our rationale for God's faith as fairy tales?
Okay, this is a really interesting question. So particularly for those of us in the room who have a faith in Jesus, how do we get a foot in the door with others who are skeptical? There's a couple of things I think could be helpful here. The first, and I've tried to illustrate it this evening, is I'm a firm believer, absolute believer in the idea that everyone believes something. And the idea that it's only Christians or people who have, say, another religious faith who believe something, and our atheist friends, if you're atheist or secular or agnostic, you believe nothing, is a total myth. Every human being believes something. Remember that David Foster Wallace quote I put up at the end? He's an atheist, and he recognized that every human being worships something. So when I meet an atheist, if they're particularly a more feisty one who wants to sort of, rubbish what I believe, I'm very happy for them to do that. I don't get offended, take it on the chin, but I will turn around and say, okay, well, tell me what you believe. Tell me what you think are the most fundamental principles of life. What do you think life's all about? And then let me have a pop at your cherished beliefs, because we all have deeply cherished beliefs. In fact, somebody said that actually every human being basically has to have an answer to 4 basic questions. Is there a God, and what is God like? What is a human being? What's gone wrong with the world, and what's the solution? And too many of my atheist friends think because they answer there isn't a God to question number 1, they can ignore questions 2, 3, and 4. So I think the first thing I would do is push back and say, okay, let's talk about your beliefs. But then equally, we can deconstruct somebody's skepticism. So if somebody says, I don't believe in Christianity, it's a load of fairy tales, I think I want to turn around and go, okay, that's a very interesting belief you hold there. What's led you to that conclusion? What's your evidence that Christianity is based on fairy tales? Because I actually think it's based on really good historical evidence, and I'm very happy to share some of that with you. But since you went first, why don't you flesh that idea out a little bit? When you do that, you often, not always, but often find there's nothing underneath. Because one of the things you can do as a skeptic is you can recycle kind of secondhand skepticism. You hear something said on the internet, you read a tweet by some high-profile celebrity atheist like Ricky Gervais or something, and you think, well, that's clever, and you try it out on the next Christian you meet, and heaven help you, would you believe it? They are actually willing to come back and do toe-to-toe and ask you a question, and then it all goes wrong. So as Christians, I think we can learn to take a step forward, politely and gently, ask our friends to defend their skepticism, give the reasons why we believe what we believe, and push them on what they believe. Because I think actually we live in a world in which we need more, not less, conversations about faith and the big questions of life. If you're an atheist here this evening, you're very, very welcome. I think it's possible to be a really thought-through atheist. If you're a Christian here this evening, don't be afraid of going toe-to-toe with our atheist friends. I think we should all be willing to talk about what we believe, debate those ideas, and see what really stands up. And the reason I'm a Christian is not just because I believe it, because I've put it to the test. I believe fundamentally and passionately it's true. I believe there's great evidence for who Jesus is, and I've put it to the test in lived experience over 25 years, and Jesus has not once let me down.
Okay, an Old Testament question now.
An Old Testament question.
Why did God choose a nation and why were they valued more than the tribes that were slaughtered?
Oh gosh, there's so much packed into this. You guys are asking great questions tonight. It's not simple little questions. They're questions with complex bits and stings in the tail and goodness knows whatever. So let's try and answer this one in about sort of 4 to 5 minutes. So why did God choose a nation? And obviously the idea here being, why did God choose the children of Israel and the Old Testament to be his people? The great thing is the Old Testament answers this question for us a number of places, because the Israelites are told in the Old Testament in a number of places that God did not choose them because they were clever or smarter or holier or better than any of the nations around them. In fact, they are repeatedly warned, don't start thinking that the reason that God chose you is because you are better, because the day you start thinking that is the day that you get rather too full of yourselves, and that before you know it, judgment will come. And if you read on in the Old Testament, of course, the nation in the Old Testament who are on the receiving end of God's judgment more than any of the other nations around is Israel. Because God uses the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians to bring judgment on his very own people when they do become full of themselves and start thinking that they're superior to others. God's vision in the Old Testament was to choose the Israelites for no reason at all, actually. God is very clear. There's nothing special about them. He chooses them purely out of his love. And the vision was that they would be a nation who, because of their relationship with God, the nations around would look at this and go, this is incredible. This is what it looks like to have a relationship with the God of the universe. We want the same thing. And the Israelites, for some of the reasons we talked about earlier in the other question, failed in that high endeavor. What about those other nations around? Well, again, the Old Testament is very, very honest right from the very beginning about what humanity is like. And of course, we know now as historians much about those nations that were around in the ancient Near East at the time of Israel. And God is very clear to the Israelites when he gives them the promised land, when he promises Abraham in the book of Genesis that the Israelites will one day have the promised land, one day have the land of Canaan. The reason is given right there, that because the nations that are currently in there, the practices, the behaviors they have engaged in have become so abominable particularly issues around child sacrifice that we know of from some of the religions that were there in Canaan before Israel came along. That God is very, very clear that the reason that those other nations are being driven out, and by the way, I forget the language that was used there. The Israelites were not told to go and slaughter. The Israelites were told to drive the other nations out. If they left, they were not to be pursued, as the land was to be cleansed. And we sometimes forget, actually, those of us even in the room who are Christians, who are followers of Jesus, we sometimes can forget, actually, that God is a God of judgment as well as a God of love. Those two things go together. Because God loves the humanity he created so much, he's also God who will act against evil. And in the Old Testament, God acts against evil very much in space and time and history. In the era that we're living in, God is very clear, if you read the Bible, that each one of us will one day face judgment. No human being escapes judgment. The question, for the Israelites and those nations they drove out, it happened very much in history. For you and I, the Bible says it will happen at the end of our lives. And the question will simply be, do you wish to stand before God in your own merits and go, you know what, I think I've lived a smart enough life that I can stand in my own shoes, thanks very much? Or do you want to be somebody who takes a look at Jesus and goes, actually, I want to stand under the shadow of Jesus and have him take the punishment that I deserve, because I know what I'm like, and I know I'm someone who's not nearly smart enough or moral enough or holy enough to do it on my own. But judgment will fall for all of us. The question is what the outcome will be. And the Bible is very clear of the difference that trust and hope in Jesus makes in that regard.
Okay, this question comes in two parts.
Two-part questions.
Yep. And the writing is awful, but I know the person, so I've already spoken to him to try and work through what he's actually saying. So,
look at that. We must have a doctor in the audience.
No, he's not a doctor. Postmodernism would focus on something if it's useful. So figures like Jordan Peterson, Douglas Murray, Tom Holland would say Christianity is a useful fiction. If it works, it's okay. So two questions. How important is it that it's true or not? And then two, how do we know it's true?
Wow. Okay, that's a very impressive question. That makes up for the handwriting, actually. Let's start with the first half of that question. So, whoever's written that, kudos to you for all the writers you quoted, because you quoted a whole raft of my favorite writers. Two of the writers on that list, for those who don't know them, are very, very interesting. So Douglas Murray and Tom Holland. Douglas Murray is a gay atheist journalist who writes for a whole range of magazines and newspapers, who has written a couple of books of late, The Strange Death of Europe, and more recently a book called The Madness of Crowds. And in both those books, he basically makes the same point, that everything that we hold dear in the West, in terms of the stuff we've talked about tonight, rights and dignity and value, the whole way that his community is part of the LGBT community, the kind of rights that they've enjoyed, actually come from the view that Christianity introduced into history of human beings having value and dignity. Tom Holland is a historian, also an atheist. His book Dominion came out last year. He took that argument even further as historian. Tom makes the point that we think human rights is self-evident. It isn't. Every society up until now that has ever existed has taken it as a granted that there are a scale of rights. Aristotle, for example, the height of the Greek civilization was very clear. There are men, there are high-class men, there are children and women, there are slaves, and you are born into a certain tier in society, and that's your station in life. Every society that ever existed has practiced slavery and has considered some human beings to be worth less than others. Something happened when Christianity took off that introduced the idea into countries that have been profoundly impacted by Christianity, that human beings, no matter what their background or gender or class, have got value and dignity. And both Tom and Douglas would say, although they don't believe it to be true, they as atheists are profoundly grateful for the Christian faith because of what it's done for value and dignity and human rights. Now, here's the thing. As that question asks, firstly, does it matter if it's true? Does it matter if it's just a useful fiction? Well, if it's just a useful fiction, that makes me fear for how long useful fictions can continue. Because how much energy can a nice idea have? Will we be able to sustain the rights and dignity that we enjoy so much for a generation or two or three or four. When you look back in history, I don't have a lot of confidence in answer to that question. We live in a blip here in the West. We live in a time when there is rights, there's universal suffrage, universal education and healthcare and all these kind of things, free speech, and the list goes on. Most humans who have lived have never enjoyed those things. If this is just a useful fiction, I have a fear for our descendants for how long these things will carry on. Secondly, if they're just a fiction, it raises the interesting question of where they came from. Because if there is no God, if we are just very cleverly evolved mammals, if we are just pretty collections of atoms and particles, where did this idea first take root that the Christian faith is actually something worth taking seriously? What's the evolutionary advantage of that? You know, evolution is pretty fickle. It's merely concerned with us surviving and reproducing. The fact that actually the Christian faith is something that we've taken seriously, invested time and energy and resources as a society into, is a little bit of a problem, I think, if you're an atheist like Tom or Douglas. And interestingly, actually, both of them, I think every book they write, they get closer and closer and closer to actually beginning to wonder whether this story is true, which leads to the second half of the question, how do we know that it's true? And I would say the primary way that I think we can know the Christian faith is true is we take a look at the founder. So I think the most important thing you can do if you are a seeker or a skeptic or a guest here this evening, you've come along at the invitation of a friend wanting to think these things through, is take a look at one of the 4 biographies of Jesus of Nazareth found in the New Testament. And you can begin asking yourself the question, does the life of Jesus stand up? Does this story have kind of, historical verisimilitude? Does this sort of look like something that happened in history? And interestingly, where we can test the Gospels historically, they stand up well. They stand up well when we test them using the tools of history, the tools of archaeology. And then when we look at the Jesus that we find in the Gospels there, you're forced to confront the question, who was Jesus? And as many, many people who've made that investigation have concluded, you only have a very limited number of options. I can see 3. Either Jesus was a fraud, he was some sort of liar or manipulator, or he was insane and had some incredibly overinflated sense of his own identity and importance. And you can ask yourself as you read the Gospels, does his behavior and the impact he had on the crowds look like a man who is a deceiver or a lunatic? And if you've ruled those out, you are really just left with the one option, that Jesus was who he claimed to be. And ultimately, the reason I'm a Christian and a follower of Jesus is not because of clever arguments, but because I've taken a look at Jesus Christ and are convinced that his claims stand up, that he was who he said he was, and that the resurrection really, really happened in history. And that's the direction I would want to push Doug and Tom, and would hope that one day they would discover that for themselves. And then the great news is you can have all the wonderful stuff that they've discovered and that they're grateful for, and the incredible, exciting confidence in realizing that it's based on something true and something solid. Best of both worlds.
Okay, thank you. Last question.
Last question.
How do you explain God's eternal nature? And really, where did God come from? Question and assumptions. How do you move from there, from a worldview to God's view?
Sorry, read that one again. That got rather complicated.
How do you explain God's eternal nature?
Yep.
And I'm trying to get the question for the second part, 'cause it doesn't read too well. But the where God came from question and assumptions, how do you go from a worldview to God's view?
Okay, I'll have a stab at that because that last part isn't entirely clear. So if you were the person who wrote that and I completely mangle what you were intending, I can only apologize. Come and grab me afterwards, or grab Jim. You'll get a more coherent answer.
Give me a row.
Okay, exactly. So in terms of how you grasp God's eternal nature, I suppose the simple answer, I'd say, as a human being, it's very hard to do that because, of course, we are mortal and God's eternal. And as human beings, we don't do time very well, let alone eternality. Most of us struggle. Once you start thinking beyond a lifespan or two, what does it mean to think of 1,000 years or 2,000 years or 3,000 years? I find as someone who works a lot in history, partly trained as a historian, even sitting there and thinking about the fact that, you're looking at some artifact and going, that's 6,000 years old. What does that mean for someone whose lifespan is less than 100 years? So we don't do time very well. And then God, who's eternal, we really don't do eternality very well. And how physicists carry on as well when they talk in sort of, the universe being 17.5 billion years old. So in terms of God, I think it much easier really to come at God through the angle the Bible does, which again brings us back to Jesus, funnily enough, because the New Testament consistently says, if you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. Because simply thinking about God in the abstract is very hard to do. How do you visualize God? How do you imagine God? But one of the radical claims that Jesus made was, anyone who has seen me, he said, has seen God the Father. In a sense, if you want to know what God was like with a human face, you would look at Jesus. And what I find so powerful about the Gospels is that brings God up very close and personal. That's both encouraging and exciting and revealing. It's also challenging, because I meet many people who I think like the idea of a kind of abstract God that you can keep at a distance. It's very easy to say, oh yeah, I believe in God. He's out there somewhere. He's a life force, or a bit like the Force in Star Wars. I haven't got to think about God. Well, the moment God steps into space and time and history, then you have to think about how I'm going to respond to him. And that becomes a great challenge. Because ultimately, and this sort of brings it down, I guess, the worldview question at the end, I think every human being really has two choices when it comes to God. You can either respond to how God has revealed himself in and through Jesus and say, look, God, I may not understand everything. I may not understand eternality. I may not understand other things, but I understand enough to say, yes, I want to follow you. I want to make you the center of my life. I want to surrender my life to you. And Jesus, call you Lord, and do my best to be your disciple. And yes, I'll make mistakes. But the wonderful news is Jesus picks us up, dusts us off, and carries us on again. That's option one. Option two is you can try and box God out. You could even say, like, I'm an atheist, don't believe in God. But of course, you try that route, all you'll end up doing is making something else God. And one of the things I find fascinating is I think so often if you're an atheist, what you effectively end up doing is making yourself God in his place. You make yourself the center of the universe around which everything else revolves. And that usually ends badly, often certainly for yourself, especially for those that you love and are close to, because you can quite easily become insufferable. None of us have the choice of worshipping nothing. David Foster Wallace's point. And so the question is, what are you going to worship and make the center of your life? Are you going to try and make the center of your life something that will ultimately let you down and disappoint you, whether that's yourself or your career or your looks or your bank balance or your circle of friends, whatever you're going to make the center of anything? Or are you going to say, you know what, I'm going to make the center of my life the God of the universe, the God who showed me how much he's loved me, because he wasn't content to remain some distant, ethereal, eternal God out there. He was also going to step into space and time and history in the person of Jesus and demonstrate how much he loved you when he went to the cross on your behalf. And that's the choice. It's not a case of God or no God, it's which God. And I can't think of any better reason to follow the Jesus and the God of the Bible than when you look at the alternatives that are on offer. And as I said a couple of times this evening, I've been following Jesus now for 25 years. He has not let me down once, and I'm grateful every day for what he's done in my life, because I know as a thinker and someone who wrestles with these questions, it doesn't take a lot of imagination for me to know what I think I'd be like were it not for the work that Jesus has done. And so for those of you who are following him, I hope tonight has encouraged you and given you food for thought, especially in talking to those who aren't. And if you're here this evening or watching on the live stream as someone who's thinking about faith, I hope something that I've shared or Jim or others have said this evening has given you food for thought to take another look at the person of Jesus.
Thanks, Andy.
We hope you're encouraged and inspired and ready to answer the call. Thank you for listening.